Talking about the Jerusalem thesis, and a big part of that thesis is the Masjid Al Haram and where exactly that is. So according to the Jerusalem thesis, the Masjid Al Haram is to be found on the Temple Mount, and there are lots of good arguments for why that is the case, and these are based on references that we can find in the Bible and how it corresponds to what it says in the Quran, and we can also look at various geographical evidence as well. Now, if we look at the timeline then, so this is when Umar builds the first masjid. Then an earthquake happens in 659. Then Muawiyah builds a new masjid. And then 692, Abdul Malik builds the Dome of the Rock. Something happened to the masjid, possibly in between those two dates, or maybe Abdul Malik decided to really put a beautiful building for that site, or put a beautiful building on that site for centuries to come. Obviously the wooden building wouldn't last forever, so he decided this is a good time as any to build a really magnificent building, and obviously thumbing his nose at the Christian churches across the hills from there. So it was obviously a statement as well as,
which is down below him actually.
That's right.
Let me interject here. Go back to that timeline, just so people are aware. When we're referring to people like Umar and Muawiyah and Abdul Malik, I hope you all know none of these are Muslims. Let me reiterate that. None of these are Muslims. We have pretty well substantiated that by looking at the coins, by looking at the rock inscriptions. There's nothing Islamic about all of them. Muawiyah, in fact, has coins where he's holding a cross and has a cross above his head, proving that he was either a Christian. The coins that he mints over in Iran have the fire altars. So Umar, we know, is from Hira. We know that Muawiyah is from Damascus. These are not Meccan. These are not Mecca and Medina, folks. Hira is what's present-day Kufa, which is over in the east in what is today Iraq. Damascus is way up, as you well know, way up in what is today Syria. So that if you have people like Muawiyah and Abdul Malik lives in Damascus as well, none of these people lived down in Mecca or Medina, down in Arabia at all. They all lived in what is today either Syria or Iraq. And that's why be careful. People think, so this is proof that Islam existed and these are what they were doing. This is the precursor. No, 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 no. None of these are Muslims. These are not Islamic structures at all. That's why, isn't it interesting what Mel's saying? Notice how similar that Muawiyah's masjid is to the tabernacle. Has anybody said that before, Mel? I think you're the first to discover that.
Yeah, possibly. But it's pretty obvious when you look at the description and you look at what the Bible says about it. They pretty much looked at the Bible and said, yeah, we'll build it exactly like that. So, you know, nothing surprising there.
You heard us also talk about Abdul Malik's Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock is not Islamic. It is Byzantine. It is Byzantine structure. So even as late as 692, they still did not have this view. They still were not Muslims. Now, Abdul Malik introduces that idea, and we've talked about this many times before. Back to you, Matt.
Yeah. Okay. So. Okay, so you remember that place there, the place where Abraham was said to have sacrificed Isaac. This is called the Sakrah. The altar of Abraham is another name for it. And it contains a number of well-kept secrets. I love secrets, and I'm going to reveal a couple of these secrets to you today. And they are really embarrassing as well, which is even better. If we look at it there, there's one hole. I think that was a shaft that was put down into the hollow below. Now, in Jewish traditions, the Sakrah is the place, as we said, where Abraham prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac. Just wanted to bring St. John of Damascus in as well, and this is something that I've mentioned before, so I'll just mention it briefly. He in the 730s he mocks the idea that they had a place that they were saying Abraham sacrificed Isaac, and he mentions down here at the bottom, he says that there's not wood for Abraham to cut down there, and it's not the place where you would leave donkeys. In other words, it's not a place that's suitable. So he was arguing that it doesn't fit with the Bible narrative. So that would suggest that they have moved the location from Jerusalem down to Mecca at this stage, because you don't have trees down there, and it's not a place for donkeys. It's obviously a place for camels. And there's the name for it there in Hebrew, which I'm not going to attempt to say. But under the Sakrah is a hollow. Where have we heard this before? It's actually referred sometimes as the Well of Souls. You can go down some steps. It derives from a medieval Islamic legend that at this place the spirits of the dead can be heard awaiting Judgment Day. And you know, there's You notice there's mihrabs. I wonder where the mihrabs are pointing towards. Are they pointing to Mecca? Be interesting. We'll come to that in a moment. Now, there's lots of interesting Islamic folk stories associated with. The cave was venerated as early as 902. Muslim tradition likewise places it at the center of the world and over a bottomless pit with the flowing waters of paradise underneath. Again, showing you how important Jerusalem was. There are four... There are 4 different Qiblas in this cavern, and none of them are to Mecca. Are you aware of this?
No, this is the first time I'm hearing it.
So, as you go down the staircase, there are 2 mihrabs to the left. So, left, which is south, is the one dedicated to the Prophet David. To the right, southeast, is a prayer niche dedicated to Solomon. I'll come back to that in a second. This mihrab is certainly one of the oldest in the world, considered to be, to date, at least back to the late 9th century.
When you say 9th century, you're saying BC or AD?
AD. Okay. And to the north is a small shrine dedicated to the Prophet Abraham, and to the northwest, another one dedicated to Elijah. So let me just go through these again. So in the northwest, there's a mihrab dedicated to Elijah. I wonder why that is. When I looked into it, I found that northwest of there is Mount Carmel, where Elijah used to be. If we look at the next one, Abraham, why north of there? These are my suggestions, by the way. I may be wrong, but it kind of makes logical sense. So north of Jerusalem, you can see there that Salam is Jerusalem, Mount Moriah, and north of there is Shechem. Shechem was the first location that Abraham went to when he entered Canaan. So obviously a very important place. South, it's one of the states. Of there, another mihrab is to David's palace. There's that one there. And then the southeast one is towards Solomon. But I've been unable to find out what exactly is connected southeast of there. So if any of you know, perhaps we can solve that mystery. But none of them are directed towards Mecca. Isn't that incredible?
Can I have a question here?
Yeah.
If you're saying that the oldest one is the mihrab towards of Abraham's, is that what you're saying is the oldest one?
Let me see.
Or the
I think
Prophet
it's
Solomon. The one to Solomon is the
Solomon one.
That's not till 9th century AD. Then these were all introduced into the Haram, or the holy place, during the rule of Islam. Why would they put these 4 in there if these are all Muslim mihrabs?
Yeah. Now there is dispute. I've gone for the most conservative date here on this one. Some, including Dan Gibson, believes that this early mihrab might go back to the beginning of the 8th century. But obviously I'm being the most conservative on this.
Nonetheless, it's after Abdul Malik. That's still after Abdul Malik, because that's 7th.
Yeah. So whichever way you play it, whether it's early or late, it's equally as damaging.
Yeah.
You know?
It's obviously, if it's 8th century, and you're going to say that the David and Abraham and Elijah would have been, those mihrabs would have been introduced around the same time or right after, immediately after Solomon. It seems to suggest, therefore, that these are still pre-Islamic.
Yeah, I would say so. And they're obviously, well, it's not necessarily obvious, but it's probably that there were pre-existing customs that the Jews had towards these places, and they've just carried them on. But obviously,
and could we at least agree on this, that these would be Umayyad? These probably would be Umayyad structures, not Abbasid. The Abbasids would have not included, because the Abbasids are the ones that take out all of this, anything that's biblical, and then introduce the idea of Muhammad and the Miraj coming on the back of the winged horse, Burak. They have to get him out of Mecca to get up there, so he has to come on a winged horse to then do the ascending the 7th heaven. That is an Abbasid narration, or an Abbasid story.
I think this is one of those aspects that the Abbasids overlooked. This one, I think. I think you're right that this is more than likely a Umayyad one, but it's highly embarrassing, it's highly damaging, because there's obviously, this is obviously an indicator that in the early days the story was very different, and you can see that it's not pointing to Mecca. Why is there not a mihrab towards Mecca?
In fact, nothing is pointing to Mecca. Just go back again. We notice when you look at the Dome of the Rock, I'll just put this image of the Dome of the Rock again. Take a look. You notice the Dome of the Rock. You also have the Dome of the Chain. I'm just going to put an arrow to it. And then also look at the Al Aqsa Mosque. All three of them. Those are the three most important structures there on that whole citadel. They're all facing Petra. Not one of those three are facing Mecca.
Yeah. Okay. Now, if we look at reason one, a very important reason why we can say that it is the masjid on the Temple Mount, it's to do with the link with Abraham. So in Genesis, it refers to Abraham building an altar on Mount Moriah to sacrifice Isaac upon. It says, "Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." What's really significant is that when we say that word Moriah in Arabic, what do we say? It is Marwa.
Marwa is Moriah.
And so that's a huge link. Now, this
So
will be something I will...
What you're saying, Mel, is the pronunciation of Moriah would be Marwa. So it's just the same pronunciation, it's the same word, but pronounced as an Arab pronunciation would, Arab would do it. So
Yeah.
this is a picture of what the rock looks like today. And isn't it the tradition, Mel, that this rock is where the sacrifice was of Isaac? This is where he was going to be sacrificed.
Yes, this is the tradition that goes back literally thousands of years. It is one of the most significant locations, and there's lots of markings in that rock. It's actually also the location of the Holy of Holies, where they kept the Ark of the Covenant.
What the Muslims have done since the Dome of the Rock was then constructed in 691, we're talking about 7th century AD, they then fashioned the story to take away the idea of Abraham and Isaac, and they put it to, this is the rock from which Muhammad ascended to seven heavens. And even some say, if you look carefully, you can see the footprint of Muhammad there, as if he pushed up from there himself, as if he jumped up to the seven heavens. Now, ironically, this is what Islam does with anything, and this is a good way to introduce us. Islam takes what is already there and they introduce their own narrative, they introduce their own story, they introduce that which makes sense. We've just mentioned this a number of episodes ago, where if you go to Mecca today, there used to always be one Jamarat. Now there are 3 Jamarats, and the reason why is because to accommodate the huge crowds that are coming, one Jamarat throwing stones, 49 or 72 stones, you hit too many people, they've had to aggrandize it with 3. But if you go to Mecca today and ask why are there 3 Jamarats, the new narrative, which has just been around since 1980, so we're talking only 40 years, is that those are all to commemorate the 3 times that the devil came to hassle Abraham. There's the new narrative, and it's just come out in the 20th and 21st century. If they're still creating these new narratives, why are we surprised they didn't do the same thing with in this case, with the rock, which was where the Temple Mount was, is you're going to say later on, it's where the Holy of Holies was for Jerusalem. I'm sorry, for the Jews. Now it has now become the place that Muhammad went to the 7 heavens.
Yep. Okay, so when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Now, if we... Now, if we look at another reason why it's significant, it's the place where Solomon built the first temple. So, as you can see from 2 Chronicles 3:1, then Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. It was on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, the place provided by David. Now, perhaps many of your viewers don't know what a threshing floor is. Perhaps maybe farmers might know what that is. But that's a place where you separated the wheat from the chaff. And obviously that's a very symbolic thing to do, because it's a symbol of the judgment day when God judges the good from the bad, the sheep from the goats. So in Judaism and also in Christianity, it was one of the places that was believed to be where the judgment day would occur and all the people would be gathered at that location. So it's a very significant place. And I think I have said all of that there. So this is the location of the apocalypse. And what's interesting, in Islamic tradition, you see that very belief, the idea that this is going to be the location of the apocalypse. Now, reason number 2 is the idea of the Kaabah itself. The Kaabah is a cube. Well, at least it's meant to be. The word means cube, but I'm sure, Jay, you're aware that the Kaabah that's in Mecca isn't actually technically a cube. It only looks a little bit like a cube, but it's actually a cuboid, perhaps you'd call it.
I'm just going to talk about that in a previous episode.
Yeah, so essentially, you can see from the description, it pretty much matches what you find in the Old Testament. They were simply copying what the old tabernacle was. They wanted to build their version of the tabernacle, where they would have the Holy of Holies in the corner, or the Kaabah, in other words. This is the location of the original Kaabah. And the area of it would have been about the size of an American football field, for those of you trying to visualize what we're talking about.
I'm going to put the picture up right here. Take a look at the picture. You can see it is really a rectangle. It is not exactly a cube. So why is it being called the cube? Because that's what Kaabah means in Arabic.
But let's have a look at what the original Kaabah was, the original cube. So if we turn to Exodus 26, it talks about the tabernacle in the wilderness. That is like the original temple. And it was essentially a large tent that the Jews would put up, and the Ark of the Covenant was kept in the end of it, in a place called the Holy of Holies. It was a cubic room, as we'll see in a moment, and God's presence was believed to be in there. So if you look at the picture on the right, you can see very clearly that cube shape, and only the high priest could go in there. Okay, so if we take a look at further references, we can see in 2 Chronicles 3:3, we have the dimensions. The portico at the front of the temple was 20 cubits long across the width of the building and 20 cubits high. Now obviously that's two-dimensional, but it suggests a cube, and this is confirmed by another reference elsewhere. He prepared the inner sanctuary within the temple to set the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord there. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 wide and 20 high. He overlaid the inside with gold, pure gold, and he also overlaid the altar of cedar. So this is really a slam dunk. The cube, the Kaabah, was originally associated with the Jewish tabernacle.
Second thing you brought up was Kaabah, and I love what you did that. Now, Paul did it earlier, but you really, I think, underlined it much better. Looking at this idea that the Kaabah is the same word that we would use for cube, and fascinating. Looking at what the Muslims have done, they've taken this idea of the cube, but they even keep it to a cube. It's not really a cube. What's the word you give it? What's the name you give it?
A cuboid.
A cuboid.
Cuboid.
But it's not it's not 20 by 20 by 20, as you have saying 20 cubits by 20 cubits by 20 cubits. The Bible made it very clear that this Holy of Holies that's there at the end of the temple that was there that Solomon built, that is actually a cube. And that's right where the Temple Mount is today. Isn't that fascinating? So that Holy of Holies has now been taken, lifted. They tried to reproduce it, possibly in Mecca. It looks like it, from what Gibson is saying, it was probably there in Mecca. But then it was much more recreated there in the 8th century, because in Mecca, and they didn't get it quite right. They didn't get it by 20 by 20 by 20. It's a cuboid. It's not actually a square like it should have been, which is probably what happens whenever you try to take something and try to mimic it. You then mock it by mimicking it because you don't get even the dimensions correct.
And now, many of the viewers may not be familiar. What exactly do I mean by the Ark of the Covenant? Jay, how would you explain the Ark of the Covenant to those who may not be familiar with that?
Well, the Ark of the Covenant is what they would take with them as God's presence with them. Whenever the Jews who were nomadic at that time, they had to move from place to place to place. The Ark of the Covenant is what they would carry, and they would then take that Ark with them so that God's presence went with them from place to place to place.
Exactly. And if I understand it correctly, the 10 Commandments were kept within that box, that Ark, and that was the reference to the covenant. So these 10 Commandments were kind of a reminder of God's presence. So obviously a very important place. And so interestingly, in Jewish tradition, the Ark of the Covenant, which is that container where the 10 Commandments were kept, the markings underneath it are still to be seen in that rock on the Temple Mount, because they were eventually kept in the Holy of Holies in the temple on that Temple Mount. So it's really significant, and that links again back to what we spoke about with Abraham and Isaac. 3 times a year. Three times a year, all your men must appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, at the festival of unleavened bread, the festival of weeks, and the festival of tabernacles. This is from Deuteronomy 16. No one should appear before the Lord empty-handed. Each of you must bring a gift in proportion to the way the Lord your God has blessed you. Now, in the original Hebrew, the name for that is Hag. So Hag HaKatzir, the festival of unleavened bread, Hag HaShavut or Shavot, and Hag HaSukkot. But when we say that in Arabic, that word Hag becomes Hajj.
Today, places like Yemen and in Egypt, the Hajj is still Hag. They're still using the G. Everywhere else they use the J sound, but they still use the G in those two countries in Arabic. So even today there is a confusion, or they just agree to disagree that whether it's a G or a J. So this obviously the Hebrew Hag, what is the equivalent to what has now become in most Arabic speaking countries Hajj.
Yep. Now, so if we look at that as well there, with the festival of unleavened bread, they have a sacrifice of a goat, as you can see, but that corresponds also with Eid al-Adha. So they've borrowed the actual meaning from the Hebrew. It wasn't there in the Arabic. And the other thing, which is also interesting, is a person who makes the pilgrimage specifically to Jerusalem is called a Hagag, which obviously would be a Hajjaj if we say it in the Arabic way. And we all know who Al-Hajjaj is, the person who was Abdul Malik's right-hand man. So that is very significant. So what's interesting here, we have the word Hajj. It comes from Hebrew and it was connected with the Temple Mount. And I think these are very good reasons to suppose that this is where the original Masjid Al Haram is. And this is a good part of the argument, I would say. Now, another aspect of this, if we look at the Feast of the Weeks from the Mishnah, it prescribes circling the temple 7 times on the 7th day. So we see a Hajj, we see the circling. So it's a great match. So in Judaism, the word for circumambulation is hakafah, which means to circle or go around, and it's a Jewish word, a Hebrew word, I should say. So this is the rock that we have referred to with the various markings. As you can see there on Sukkot, the reader's platform is circled on each of the 7 days of the holiday. This spot on the Temple Mount is the exact location of the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was once kept. And also, if you think about the story of Jericho, they walked around that 7 times on the 7th day, and then the walls came crashing down. And they were carrying the Ark of the Covenant as well to boot. And not incidentally, they walk around it anti-clockwise, which is exactly what Muslims do as well. So in Judaism, starting things from the right side is considered to be important, since the right side is the side of chesed, which is kindness, while the left side is the side of gevura, which is judgment. So it's kind of like mercy versus judgment. So that's why Jews go around anti-clockwise. And you can see, once again, the copycats have copied the Jews here. And that reinforces the idea that this is where they've taken their ideas from in Jerusalem, from the Temple Mount.
Islam is
we're on to reason 4 now. The idea of the house of God. So I'm sure the Christian viewers will be familiar with this. Pretty much in lots of parts of the Bible, it refers to the temple as the house of God. Probably the most common one to most of the viewers would be what Jesus said, "My house will be a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of robbers." And there's many other references to the house of God in the Bible in reference to the Temple Mount. So if we move on to reason 5, Baka, we find in the Quran the first house created for mankind at Baka, 396. So this is something that Paul mentioned in passing, that it comes from Psalm 84. If you look at the references in bold, they all relate to the Temple Mount. So you have the courts of the temple, you have the altar, you have the reference to the house, and the Valley of Baca is really a symbol of the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So that's the link. there with Jerusalem once again. I don't know if you want to say something on that, Jay.
Oh, and Paul did bring this up, and this is something we need to underline. I noticed that one or two people in the comments also brought this up. Becca was always a place that you stopped on the way to Jerusalem. It was a rest stop. It was a place to get your energy up before you actually went to Jerusalem, with all that what that entailed. And so Becca is well known in the Bible, and it is not Mecca at all. If in fact there are three different references, three different places from biblical context where Becca could be. Today, the most popular one would be in Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley. But certainly, this is so well known in the Bible. To try to assume, Muslims trying to assume that this is Mecca, obviously, you need to look and see. Becca, chapter 3, verse 96, is referring, if the Quran, it is taking the word that is taken straight out of the biblical context of a place as a rest stop on the way to go to the pilgrimage there in Jerusalem.
Yep. Okay.
Islam is nothing, there's nothing original in Islam. We have noticed this, we have known this. We have said this about the Quran itself. That one of the things that we have been saying for years is that so much of the Quran is borrowings from Jewish apocryphal writings written in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, up until the 6th century, and also Christian Syriac Aramaic writings, many of them lectionaries, discussions that were meant to be discussions, never meant to be a literary piece. Had them been borrowed and put into a book. But when you take it from the Syriac Aramaic or Aramaic Syriac, you then deform it, and the Arabic then had all kinds of problems because it could not have accommodated, the script could not have accommodated something that was so sophisticated that it was coming out of these lectionaries. Now, what you have done here, you've looked at 7 things. I think there are 7. I think I'm correct on that. You started with Moriah, and here's a picture of the map that Paul put up. Let's just put it up there. So you can see where Moriah is. There you can see where Scopus is, the 2 different mountains. And you can see where the Kidron Valley is in between. You can even see where Gehenna was. Now, did you notice Gehenna, 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 Gehenna? There's the G and the J, confusion of the G and the J. So Gehenna would be the Hebrew. Gehenna has not been changed to Gehenna. It's still the same idea of hell. So Paul brought that up there as an afterthought in the video we did yesterday. When you look at it, it actually is a straight borrowing out of what the Jews had already done. Second thing.
Yeah, and one other little thing before we finish there today is that we have a reference to the Caliph Mansur buildings on the site of Mecca in 754, expanding the area and so on. And this is in the Kitab Akbar Makkah by the author Al-Azraqi, writing about 100 years afterwards. So before 754, there is almost no reference to Mecca. We have that 741 reference, but apart from that, that's it. So it all looks very much like Mecca took off sometime in the early part of the 8th century. But I think based on what I've shown you earlier on in this video, that it looks very much to me that really it was Jerusalem in the early days is where the focus was, and then it got shifted eventually down to Mecca.
And I think what is fascinating here, you're showing almost everything we are seeing that Islam has finally created or finally settled on during the Abbasid period. If you go back to the 7th century, as we've always asked you to do, when you go back to the 7th century, look and follow the evolution of how Islam finally created this. John Moscus, who refers to the Masjid of Umar, who comes from Hira, which is today Kufa in Iraq. He invades, takes over Jerusalem in about 638, and he then refers to this masjid, but this John Moscus talks us about this cursed masjid. He's referring to how did this guy put this masjid up there, because this is a Jewish site. So you can already see there's antagonism between the Arabs and the Jews, even this early. We're talking about 638. Anastasius, then in 660, you talk about the time of, this is when, just before Muawiyah comes to power in 661, and that Muawiyah then builds the masjid there, rebuilds it in around 660, 661. Aruf or Arkuf in 670, then you refer to, talks about that the shape of this place that was built there was long, much like what we know as the Ark of the Covenant, or the Tabernacle. Sorry, not
Tabernacle, yeah.
The Tabernacle that you see in Judaism. So it still suggests, therefore, that these are either still Jews, or they still are biblical, or they are Christians, but they are still following the biblical text, the biblical context. And then you talk about the Sakrah, and you mentioned that the rock is haram, and we asked Murad, who came on, told us that actually that haram, it doesn't just mean forbidden. That's what Muslims have put to it. That's the imposition they have put on that word. It actually meant hollow. So the hollow masjid, or the hollow place of bowing. Well, if you take a look today, it's still there, and that's underneath the rock. I didn't know this. This is good that you're bringing this up. This hollow below the rock. And when you looked at that, you said if you go down there, you will notice that there are not just one mihrab. Now, for people who don't know what a mihrab is, if you were to go into any mosque today, anywhere in the world, you will see a niche that's put at where the whole masjid is facing, and that would be the prayer point. That's where the prayers go. That is the mihrab that would show where the Kiblat was. That means the direction of prayer. Well, you said that there are 4 of these mihrabs that have been placed down there, and they are even named. And it's fascinating, the names you gave to them. You have one that is named, that's going towards the northwest. That's the Elijah mihrab. You have one that's going straight north, that's facing, you say, Shechem, which is the Abrahamic mihrab. You have one that's facing straight south, which would be the Davidic mihrab. And then you have one facing southeast, southeast, which would be Solomon's mihrab. Fascinating, because these are all introduced sometime in the 7th and beginning of the 8th century, and which would suggest that these are Umayyad mihrab. So somewhere along during the Umayyad period, you have this view, this still very strong biblical view, that Jerusalem is the center of everything, and these mihrabs are pointing to historical places that the great prophets either lived in, or had something to do with, or was important to their story. And then you ended with John of Damascus, and you mentioned that John of Damascus is in 730, so you're well into the 8th century now. He's there in Damascus. He's there in the courts of the Umayyads still. They're weakening and weakening and weakening, and the Abbasids still haven't come to power, and he mocks them. And he says, why are you now talking about this place where the sacrifice is going on? He knows it's in Jerusalem and Mount Moriah, but now it's been changed to another place that has no wood. Well, what has no wood? Where is a place that's devoid of any vegetation? That's Mecca. So it looks like around the 730s, that's when Mecca is chosen, which fits exactly our timeline. This fits our timeline perfectly. And if you just scratch around, you can see how this all fits together. I love this, Mel. So by looking at the masjid, Paul introduced it in his talk and his video. You've taken it a step further, says, let's continue with that masjid. Let's look and see why Jerusalem is so important. Not only because it's important in the 7th century, it's important to the rulers who were there. Umar, and certainly Muawiyah, and Abdul Malik. It's important to all 3. They may not have the same reasons. Abdul Malik was much more of a political reason, because he is confronting the Byzantine Christianity, and that's why he puts his he puts those inscriptions there on the inner ambulatories, but they all are they're all in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is hugely significant because this is where always God has met his people. Mecca was not important, even as late as 691. 730, this is the first time I've heard you say this, and this is terrific. It looks like we're going to look at the early 8th century to understand where this is now being brought down to Mecca. And it looks like that Mecca from there on out becomes then the place of importance. Once you choose Mecca, you've got to give it a story. You've got to give it a history. You've got to give it significance. So what do? You take that which is in Jerusalem, you bring it down, which has probably been also in Petra, and you bring it down to Mecca.
Obviously, we're talking about
then you went to the third thing, and that is the Hajj. And that's the idea of the G and the J. The G and the J are interchangeable. The Hajj that you have in Hebrew, and you talk about the 3 feasts, they're all there at the temple, are they not? They're all there in Jerusalem. That has been recreated by Islam as the Hajj, which even includes the 7 circumambulations. I'm sorry, going this way. It actually goes anti-clockwise, as we now found. It goes the other direction because it's going towards that which is kind, that which is going towards the kindness rather than the judgment. Interestingly, the Muslims have done the same thing. But ask a Muslim, why 7? How many times have I asked Muslims, why are you going 7 times around? And I've never bothered to ask them, why are they going anti-clockwise? I'm going to do it from here on out. Thanks so much, Mel. Because the Jews did this. Because this is what was done in Jerusalem. The fact that you sacrifice there. They have a whole plain for sacrifice there in Mecca today. That was done at the temple. And it was all done at that Temple Mount where now the Dome of the Rock sits. Now, number 4, you then went into the house of God. The house of God is well known in the Bible as the temple. And that's why but Jesus drove out the money changer, because how dare you desecrate the house of God in Luke that you put there. And then you went into number 5, Becca, and the idea that Becca is to be Mecca. No, it's not, folks. We know where Becca is. Get it straight. Get your history straight. Get the geography straight. Look and see where Becca is. It's on the way to get to Jerusalem. It was a rest stop that is well known by the Jews. Nothing new under the sun. We're now finding exactly how Islam really was recreated. It was a recreation of what had already been. Would you not say that? We're looking at the tradition that was there had to be brought down, had to be Arabized, had to take it away from Jerusalem, even take it away from Petra and bring it down, as the Abbasids had to create their own narrative, their own hegemony, their own identity, and their identity was in Mecca. That's why when you look and see what's there today, these are nothing more than facsimiles, and they don't even have the right dimensions.
Well, I think it's pretty obvious now that what you had originally was a Fertile Crescent religion that was transposed down into Arabia Deserta. It does not make sense for it to have started in an uninhabited place with no cultural influences whatsoever, almost no population. It clearly all happened up north. We've seen that again and again, no matter what topic we've looked at. The common theme is it's all up north, and that's where we find the origins of Islam.
There you go. And it makes sense it's all up north because that's where the civilizations were, and that is where the history is. That's where all the coins are. That's where all the rock inscriptions are. That's where all the buildings are. That's where everything takes place because that's where people live. You can start to think, and it just makes your head swirl how absolutely ahistorical this Islam is. They should never have tried to borrow something that was so intrinsically valuable and so intrinsically historical and so intrinsically based on everything we know. And the archaeology supports almost everything the Bible says. If you're going to take on the Bible historically and archaeologically and geographically and theologically and try to reproduce everything down 1,000 miles further south, be careful what you touch, because we won't argue. The rocks will cry out for us, and the rocks are doing just that. It's the rocks that are crying out for us. It's the archaeological evidence that's coming to light. It's all the inscriptions and all the documents and all the coins and all the, in this case, even the buildings. It's so good. It's so easy, and it's made our job that much easier.